The Torah tells us regarding bringing the korban, ki yakriv bikem. It could have said, Odov ki yakriv korban Hashem. What's bikem? From your own, bikem from yours. So here the Sephardo says, interesting, ki yakriv mi'atzchem, meaning you have to bring the korban with, it's alluding to with confession. When you bring it's bikem, you have to be brought with the korban. It has to be together with yourself. It's not, it's arm's length. You have a debt to pay, you're paying a debt. That's not what a korban is. It's bikem, you have to have part of yourself in the korban. What does that mean? We have to have part of yourself in the korban. So the Ramban writes that, what is the concept of korban? If korban's atonement, as we mentioned, that a korban can only be brought if one violates something inadvertently, or it's a donation. It's voluntarily being brought. But if it's deliberate, you're not able to bring the korban, as we explained yesterday, that because the impurity of the sin is transferred onto the korban, as a result of that, if it's inadvertent, it's something which is acceptable. But if it's deliberate, the korban takes on a putrefied status. Therefore, it's not appropriate to bring it in the Mishkan, Beis Hamikdash. But what is the concept of the korban? In reality, really, even when you transgress inadvertently, really the sin should compromise you that you should even die, or you should be seriously compromised by the korban being sacrificed. It's being brought in your place. In truth, you should have been slaughtered. Your blood should have been sprinkled. Your remains should have been burnt. However, Hashem is willing to take the korban, the sacrifice, in your place. Why? Because since you acknowledge what you did is unacceptable and you have remorse, and you commit yourself not to violate it in the future, which is the whole concept of tshuva, the impurity which is upon the person transfers onto the animal. But the only way that impurity can be released from yourself to be transferred onto the animal, this is only if you do vidui. Tshuva without vidui, as we saw Rabbeinu Yonah, based on the Gemara and the Rambam, the tshuva does not atone. Tshuva only atones if you have that verbal expression, which is called confession. So it's mikem. When you bring the korban, you have to have part of yourself associated with that korban. It's from yourselves. Yourselves are associated with that animal, that the animal is the equivalent of yourself being brought. And only then does it achieve the atonement. Okay? Now, we have once mentioned that in the name of the Ramak, why is tshuva? Why does tshuva have to be verbalized? The Rambam writes that a person has remorse in his heart and does not verbalize the remorse and the sin and commits himself not to go to transgress again, the tshuva is not valid. So the Minchas Chinuch asks a question from a Gemara in Kedushin. Gemara says in Kedushin that if a man marries a woman, he's a Rasha. He's a Rasha. That's his classification. And he marries a woman on the condition that he's a tzaddik. I'm marrying on the condition that I'm an absolute tzaddik. So the Gemara says it's Sofi Kedushin. It's questionable. It may be Kedushin. Why? Because Shema Hirur Tshuva Belibo. Because maybe he had stirrings of Tshuva in his heart. So the Chinuch asks, but if Tshuva, as the Rambam writes, is only valid if you have verbal confession, what's the question? If he said it, you hear it. He said, I have remorse. I will not go back to violate anything that I violated in the past. So he is a tzaddik. So why is it Sofi Kedushin? Maybe he had stirrings of tshuva in his heart. Either if you verbalize, we know he did tshuva, then it's considered valid tshuva. If he doesn't verbalize it, then it's not tshuva. So how does the Rambam write, based on the Gemara, that tshuva is only tshuva to bring about the atonement and to cause this change if you verbalize it? That's the Minchas Chinuch's question. So Minchas Chinuch answers this. It's two concepts. if a person is sincere that he will turn over a new leaf, and in his heart he has remorse, and he's going, I'm not going back there. He's reclassified. His classification is no longer Rosh Tzaddik. However, regard to the atonement process, he's only atoned if he meets all the criteria of tshuva. That's remorse, commitment to the future not to violate, and you verbalize, you confess that which you feel in your heart and your commitment to the future. And you articulate the sin. But if you just have remorse in your heart and you have all that and you don't do the verbal confession, the atonement aspect is not brought about. So kapara you don't have. But are you reclassified? Are you a tzaddik? Definitely. Because since you're sincere, you're turning over a new leaf. You no longer can behave as you behaved in the past. The person's a tzaddik. So since he didn't verbalize it, we don't know. Maybe his classification is tzaddik. Because Shem and Hiru Tshuva believe. Maybe the stories of Tshuva in his heart, and maybe he did turn over a new leaf. Therefore, it's Safek Kedushin. But if he verbalizes it, not only is he reclassified, the actual effect of the tshuva is he's rehabilitated. Whatever that impurity which he possessed, which he compromised him, is removed from him, and it vaporizes it, and it's no longer associated with him. Therefore, it's not only is he reclassified, but it's a full level of rehabilitation. That's the Minchas Chinuch's answer. So the korban is not only a reclassification, it's kapora. Kapora, the Gemara says in Zvachim, it's actually the slate is wiped clean. There's no trace of that negative record associated with the person any longer. He's fully purified. The record is cleansed. It's a cleansed record. That's kapora. That's the idea. So it's when you bring that korban and you have a mind, really, I understand I should have been slaughtered. My blood should have been sprinkled. I should have been burnt. But it's Rachmei Hashem. It's God's mercy that He's willing to take this in my place, and you have remorse and you commit yourself, then you're fully reinstated. You're rehabilitated. This is the understanding. So now it's interesting. You'll never find by korban ever the appellation of Hashem Elokim. It's Ki Yovi Korban Lashem. The only appellation of Hashem associated with korban is Midas HaRachmim. Within the context of Midas Hadin, there's no such thing as korban. I mean, if you're liable, you're guilty, you have to pay the price. That the korban, this process that the impurity of the sin transfers onto the animal. If it's predicated on tshuva, the korban achieves that rehabilitative effect. That's Midas HaRachmim on the ultimate level. Therefore, you'll never find the appellation of Elokim, which is the attribute of din, associated with bringing a korban for that reason. That's the understanding. Now, the Rambam rules that although today we no longer have a Beis HaMikdash, and we're not able to bring korbanos, sacrifices, nevertheless, what's Mizbach Kapara? What is the altar of atonement? Tshuva. Tshuva is the altar of atonement. Now the question is, but if the whole concept of the korban is that the impurity of the person transfers onto the animal, I mean, how is tshuva mizbach kapara? Right? How is that the altar of atonement? Seemingly, that impurity still lingers and stays with us because without transferring onto anything. The only time you're fully rehabilitated, which is kapara, it's only if that impurity is released from the person. It has to be released onto something. So the Gemara tells us in Menachos that kol ha'omed parshas chatos kilu hikru chatos. That when you say the portion of chatos, sin offering in the Torah, and you say those psukim, and as Rabbeinu Bach explains, and you understand all the details and aspects of bringing the chatos, when you say those words, it says kilu hikru chatos. It's as if you brought a chatos. And if you say the parsha of Ola, burnt offering, kilu hikri of Ola, it's as if you brought the Ola offering. And every korban you say, when you say the parsha in the Torah, you say the parsha of Osham, the guilt offering, kilu hikri of Osham, every one of them. So it's a little bit difficult. So first of all, the Rambam, so there's a famous question which is asked by the Minchas Chinuch, The Gemara tells us in Shabbos, Rabbi Shmuel, there's an argument between Rabbi Shmuel and the Chachomim. Are you permitted to read by candlelight on Shabbos? The Chacham say you're not permitted to read by candlelight by Shabbos. Why? Unless you have somebody watching you and observing to make sure that when you read, because when you become engrossed in what you read, a person would normally manipulate the wick, because if the light starts getting dim due to there's some carbon on the wick, a person very often naturally manipulates the wick. And if you do that, you're in violation of Havara. You're kindling, because you're causing the oil to be absorbed to a greater degree in the wick. That's kindling. It's Torah violation. So the Chum say that unless you have somebody standing by to make sure you don't touch the wick in the oil candle, you're not permitted to read by that candlelight. Shmuel says, Ani ekro v'lo ateh. I will read by that candle. I'm not concerned about manipulating the wick. Touching the wick. What happens? Rabbi Shmuel read by candlelight, v'hito, and he did. I mean, he violated. Inadvertently, he violated the law of what? Of kindling. So he wrote in his personal diary, when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, he lived after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, Avi Chato Shmeino. I'll bring a fat sin offering. When the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, I'll bring a fat sin offering. So they asked, but according to the Rambam, that he says today that we're not able to bring the sin offering. The Mizvah Kapara is tshuva. The altar of Kapara is doing tshuva. What did Rabbi Shmuel have to record that when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, will bring the sin offering? Let him say the portion of Chatos. And of course, he understood what all the details of what it was. He's atoned. So if he's atoned, it says Ki'ilu Hikriv Chatos. So if that's the case, he already brought the Chatos. So when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, there's no reason to bring the Chatos. He's already absolved from that obligation. That's the question of Minchas Chinuch asks. Minchas Chinuch answers, it doesn't say Hikriv Chatos. It says Ki'ilu Hikriv Chatos. It has a semblance of Chatos, meaning it has a semblance to bring about the majority of the atonement. Factually, the sin still is on the record. So to really cleanse the record, that's Avi Chato Shmeino. When the Beis Hamikdash we rebuilt, so with what we're saying now is because what's the process of a korban? The impurity that's on the person, that if when you do tshuva and you do the confession, which is the verbal confession, the impurity of the person transfers onto the animal. Then unless you have the object for it to transfer on, that impurity lingers on. And that impurity is part of the lack of cleansing. You're not fully cleansed. Therefore, Rabbi Shmuel had to record in his personal diary, Kishibon Beis Hamikdash, when the Beis Hamikdash was built, Avi Chato Shmeino, I'll bring that fat sin offering for that reason. Because the whole concept is the transfer of the person onto the object, the korban. Now, the Gemara tells us, for instance, say Chatos Osham. A Chatos Osham, which are sin offerings, guilt, it has associated sin, inadvertent. The only people that permitted to eat those korbanos are only male Kohanim. Even the wife of the Kohen is not permitted to eat it. Only the male Kohanim. It's based on a pasuk, and the Gemara says, "Asher kupar behem," and when they eat it, it brings about atonement. It says, "Kohanim ochlim," the Kohanim when they eat the korban, balim miskaprim. The one who brought the korban, they have atonement. Through the consumption of the korban, the person who brought the korban, he's atoned. Now, so the way we're explaining it, what's the concept? The impurity of the sin went on the korban, on this consecrated animal. This is what happened. And you went through the ritual, slaughtering, sprinkling blood, burning its innards, and now the quantum eat the animal, eat that particular species, whether it's the sin offering or the guilt offering. What are they eating? They're eating the object which has that impurity on it. That consumption that takes that impurity and takes it out of existence. It no longer exists. That's what happens. What happens now, every korban has a certain time limit, it has an expiration moment. First, achatos can only be eaten for a day and a night. an osham, a day and a night. Once the morning comes, dawn, it's called nosar. It becomes nosar. It's called leftover. You're not permitted to eat it. It has to be burnt. The Torah says anything that's left till morning has to be burnt. It's mitzvah aseh. It says do not leave it over till morning. It's a negative commandment. And if you leave it over till morning, the eish yishrofu, it must be burnt. What's the concept? You're a violation of a negative commandment. The animal should be consumed, or should be, it's an older burnt offering. It should be sacrificed and burnt on the Mizbeach. And if you leave it till dawn, you're in violation of a negative commandment. But however, it's called the lavdit laseh. When you burn it, that's a correction on the negative commandment, because it's a mitzvah aseh. So the way we're explaining it, it was supposed to be consumed either by the Kohen or burnt on the Mizbeach. So whatever impurity that it had, it would have taken it out of existence. It was left till morning. It meant it reached the expiration date. The Kohen's not permitted to eat it. You're not permitted to put it on the Mizbeach. If that's the case, that impurity hasn't been taken out of existence because that impurity is on that korban. Torah says, you know what you do with it? There's a mitzvah say, burn it. When you burn it, you fulfill a positive commandment, and because it's being consumed through a positive commandment, whatever impurity was there, it doesn't exist any longer. What happens if a person should eat the nosa? It's kosher meat, but when it reaches the expiration moment, the person who eats the nosa, the Torah says, he's chayv koris. Spiritual excision. Why spiritual excision? Before the expiration date, moment, not only it was a mitzvah to eat it, and when the Kohen ate it, it brought about kapora. When it's burnt on the Mizbeach, it brought kapora. However, if you should eat it now, when it reaches the expiration moment, it's so extreme, it's koris. What's the reason? Because since it's no longer viable, because it wasn't brought in its time, that impurity remains on that animal. So normally, if it's within the context that you're permitted to eat it, the consumption is part of the kapara process. But it passes the expiration moment, that impurity remains on that animal. And because it remains on that animal, and it's not qualified to bring about the atonement, what are you ingesting? The Kohen who eats it, or whoever eats it, the Kohen, the Yisrael, whoever may eat that, is actually ingesting something which has this lethal impurity. That lethal impurity creates that distance between the person and God, and that's the concept of koris, of spiritual excision. You're excised. There's a detachment due to what the person ate because it has this impurity on it, according to what we're understanding, the way we're explaining it. The Chazon Ish writes, we know that as there's a difference between deliberate sin, deliberate transgression, and defiance. Defiance is the most extreme level of transgression. Although I can eat kosher, I eat non-kosher in spite of God's commandment. I will not eat kosher. That's called defiance. Mazid, when you deliberate, I have a desire to eat meat, and the only meat that's available is non-kosher. I'm eating the non-kosher because I am a priority. Because to satisfy my desire, that takes priority of God's will, but that's not defiance. Both cases, it's called mazid, except one is more extreme because the intent is different intent. Okay? Now, what happens if a person has no background, that he has an understanding of something is not permitted? Another person knows better. And despite knowing better, both of them know. They know the law, except one really knows better because he's already has that orientation and he has the capacity to fully appreciate that he shouldn't cross that line, and he crosses that line. The other person is about tshuva, he's new to it. He's not able to internalize it the way the first person internalized it. The transgression of the person who was always observant is a more severe transgression than the Baal Tshuva. Because the level of understanding this is greater. So when you cross that line, it was considered a more serious transgression than the other person. They're both amazing. So the Chazon Ish writes today, that we no longer have the Beis Hamikdash. We no longer have the environment. When we hear something's not permitted, we don't fully internalize it to the point we know it's like cerebral. It's more on the cerebral. Therefore, even when we do the wrong thing, it doesn't have the severity of at one time when a person would do something wrong. I'll give you an example. Like time to Beis Hamikdash, in the repetition of the Amida Musaf on Yom Kippur, we have the Avoda. We have the Avoda. And we speak about what they witnessed on Yom Kippur. And we keep saying Mara Kohen. When they saw the Kohen coming with his vestments and doing the service, Mara Kohen, it was like amazing. You were touched in a way we can't even relate to the way they were touched. It could internalize it. A person who had that level of understanding, if he would transgress, it's a much more severe level of transgression. Because internalizing that reality, and now you cross that line, the consequence is much, much greater. However, a person today, we don't even have an understanding of what that is. It's purely we only know it's wrong. When you cross that line, it's not the same thing. Okay? I'll give you an example. I myself had the privilege of having relationships and appreciating what Gedolei Torah are. Because I studied yeshiva, my Rabbeim, some of them were leading Torah sages in the world, and others were unique in their own right, and they were one of a kind in the world. And I spent years being mentored by these people, being taught by them, so I had an appreciation of who they are. And now I tell you who they are, and you meet them. You can have an understanding who they are the way I understand who they are. Because I interacted with them, and I was exposed to them, and I saw and witnessed their behavior, and therefore I have a different level of understanding, appreciation with than you have. Therefore, if I would act disrespectfully regarding who they are, my level of liability would be greater than yours. Because you knowing, you know, but you don't know the way I know. It's a different reality. So therefore, if God forbid, if I should cross that line, it's a much more severe transgression than somebody who doesn't have the capacity to appreciate what that is. So the Chazon Ish said today, because we're so far removed from understanding what it really is, today we border almost on the inadvertent. Even when you do something deliberate, it borders on the inadvertent. Because we're not able to fully wrap our heads around what that reality is. Therefore, as a result of that, although it's mazid, but it's like quasi shogig. That's the Chazon Ish.
Who would join me in this?